So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, John, for bringing us together. Thank you so much, my fellow panelists, for sharing this space with me, and y'all for coming, taking the time to be here to listen to this conversation and be in conversation with us, right? So my name is Nara Roberta Silva. I am core faculty at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, where I also coordinate the Praxis program that is focused on movement organizations. So considering here the scope of our panel, I want to begin with a question, right, that guides my remarks today. What kind of political education is necessary, not just to resist the present, but to understand it well enough to move beyond it? And now, to start exploring this question, I think it's important to situate my intervention from the outset. So I'm speaking from a position that is neither fully inside nor outside academia, right? So my reflections emerge from working in an institution whose central mission is to create, right, structured learning spaces, learning environments for adults, which is the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. These are accessible yet very rigorous learning spaces where participants include not only curious learners, let's put it this way, but also organizers, nonprofit professionals, educators, people working in movement organizations in general. We sometimes joke internally that what we offer, like the Institute, is grad school for the masses. But I do want to resist the framing of what we do as an alternative or even a model, right, to be replicated wholesale. Like, don't do what we do. Institutions like the Brooklyn Institute, they are not anti-university, right? I see us as para-university, and I think this distinction is analytically important, right? So para-university efforts tend to emerge in moments of political turmoil or institutional crisis, right? So in this sense, they are not simply innovations, they are symptoms. So historically, we've seen similar formations flourishing when universities were either exclusionary, politically constrained, or somehow unable to meet broader intellectual demands or sustain public face inquiry. So for me, right, the central question then is not really how to fix the university, right? So that's a very valid question, of course, right? But assuming that para-university institutions are recurrent historical formations that are always going to show up in moments of crisis, the more productive question from my vantage point is, where does critical knowledge migrate when universities become structurally constrained, right? And what new issues emerge, what new issues become visible as a result of that migration. So I would say that from my vantage point then, moments of crisis in the university, they show that they show clearly, really, that movements, like social movements themselves, can be, and in fact are, sites of critical knowledge production. So movements have embraced the mission of education and the role of educators at many moments in history, right? So you have worker schools in the early 20th century, you have freedom schools in the 1960s, and I mean, I can keep like citing other examples. And to me then, like at this very moment, by assuming that movements are sites of knowledge, I want to seize the opportunity to rethink what we mean by political education, right? So often when we speak of political education, the word political, right, is treated as a descriptor of content. So political education becomes rising awareness about politics, so about the state, about institutions, about class, etc. So in this sense, political means a topic, but there is another meaning, right? Political education can also mean preparing people for political engagement, right? So here then, political indicates a practice. So education that supports organizing and organizational work. So there is, of course, an overlap, right, between these two meanings of political education, but they are not really identical, right? Like the second meaning, education for engagement, often become a component of movement infrastructure, right? I like to say that it's kind of a reproductive labor of movements, right? So training, skill sharing. So, and here is where I think that we encounter a problem, right? When the second meaning eclipses the first. So in the current conjuncture, many movements treat education primarily as an immediate, as a tool for immediate tactical efficacy. So the focus becomes organizing skills, messaging framework, leadership pipelines, theory of change, etc. And this is all very important, don't take me wrong, right? But when education becomes reduced, when education is reduced to this level, it becomes instrumental or simply a means to short-term output. So what gets lost is precisely historical and structural analysis, right? So the understanding of the ways economic, social, cultural, political factors combine and then shape the realm of intervention. And when that happens, political imagination becomes constrained, right? Precisely at the moment when crises demand expansion, demands that we think the new, right? So if our diagnosis of the present is really thin, then our horizon of what is possible, our horizon of what can be done is also gonna be really thin. So for example, in one of our programs with organizers working on mass mobilization against authoritarianism, we spent several sessions, right, on the history of financialization. And what changed as a result was not just their messaging, right? They came to us asking for help with their messaging. And that changed entirely after the sessions. But not only that, right? What changed as a result of the sessions was also the way that they understood the terrain of struggle, because now the authoritarian churn of the country was not considered an aberration, right? But it was an expected outcome of neoliberalism. So, and that required intervention not only in political institutions, but also in economic institutions. So their very strategy of that organization changed, right? So, and this is what I mean by the difference between a narrow and an expansive view of political education within movements, right? A narrow view folds education into the technical dimension of organizing, whereas an expansive view treats education as collective inquiry into strategy. And I would add, right, that a narrow view often feeds a subtle form of anti-intellectualism, right? Not always in the sense of rejecting ideas outright, but in reducing intellectual engagement to formulas, right? So then scholarship is rhetorically appreciated while effectively treated as something to, at best, extract quick lessons from, right? Extract formulas. And I want to be very clear here. This anti-intellectualism that I'm referring to is not a moral failure, right? It's not about individual laziness. It's not about, it's not even inherent hostility to theory. Rather, it is a structural effect. So several forces contribute to this narrowing of political education and its instrumentalization, right? So the non-profitization of organizations, grant cycles, the professionalization of organizing, right? So these conditions, they make sustained study seem like a luxury. And of course, academia is not innocent in this process either, right? To come back to the beginning of the presentation, right? Universities have often retreated from public-facing theory. They have rewarded specialization over generalization, right? Generalization has a bad rap, right? They have hoarded language and prestige, right? They have treated movements as objects of studies, right? Data, rather than partners in shared inquiry. So in light of this assessment, and knowing that these are structural conditions, right? We also have to be realistic about what we are facing, right? So in light of this assessment, reclaiming political education in its full potential cannot mean vaguely, right, calling for more education, like asking people to read more books, asking people to just like engage more, right? This like voluntaristic approach. What we are confronting a structural configuration that directly or indirectly disincentivize deep study, right? So what is required then is building conditions that make expensive political education possible, right? So for example, time structures that allow slowness. So serious studies requires time, like duration, right? It requires wrestling with returning to questions. It requires revising interpretation. It requires allowing disagreement to unfold. So without protected time, right, if you don't protect time for that, right, political education collapses into briefings, into like these shared formulas, right? We also need pedagogies that assume adults are capable of theory, right? Like the assumption that non-academic audiences need only simplified content is condescending and underestimate their ability, their analytical capacity, right? And we also need institutions that are willing to accept non-scalability, right? Temporarily or permanently, right? So the culture is usually, right, like growth and replication. So then accepting pauses, right, and a slow pace that is necessary for reflection then becomes, it's a must. And most importantly, in my perspective, we need to reevaluate study, like we need a reevaluation of studying as a collective practice, right? So political education should not focus exclusively on individual activists who are improving themselves, right? We must also address organizations as collective actors, right? The entire organization needs to be lifted up rather than a few organizers. So how do organizations build shared vocabulary? How do they develop historical memory? How do they create internal spaces for strategic reflection, right? Rather than constantly outward mobilization. These are all questions that to me are folded into this idea of studying as a collective practice and more, right? So to conclude, right, let me return to the question that I posed at the beginning. What kind of political education is necessary, not just to resist the present, but to understand it well enough to move beyond it? So, a tentative answer here, like packing everything that I said, like we need political education that is sustained rather than episodic, strategic rather than reactive, collective rather than individualized, expensive rather than narrow, right? So, and at stake is the capacity to build strategies that are not only improvised or not only concerned with the short term, but that actually also starts to envision the long term, right? Efforts to build a new world require more than technical training, right? So they required a shared understanding of the systems that they seek to transform. Without that, our political, even the most, even the greatest, most rehearsed projects, they often reproduce the logics that they oppose and they collapse. So para-university spaces like the one that I'm in, they are not solutions in themselves, as I said in the beginning, right? What truly matters is that we think ways to make critical knowledge circulate wildly, right? Across universities, across movements, across communities. So it's the task is not to retreat into enclaves of knowledge when when we think about political education, but then to weave analysis back into organizing itself, right? So if crisis demand imagination, then imagination requires study, right? That's it, right? Thank you.